The U.S. military on the hunt. Suspected drug boats are being attacked and blown up in international waters along with their occupants as the Trump administration moves a powerful array of naval assets into the Caribbean. Are the attacks legal? Is the U.S. poised to attack Venezuela itself? There's a lot more going on than you might think. Hello and welcome to The Brief, a podcast that brings analysis and perspectives on key issues in global affairs. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. What's happening in the Caribbean is certainly increasing tensions in Latin America, but could well reverberate around the world. It's not just about Washington and Caracas, and it's not just about the drug trade either. Our guest on this edition of The Brief is former U.S. Ambassador to Panama, John Feeley. He worked in the State Department in various senior roles, advising both Republicans and Democratic administrations on Latin American affairs. Between 1983 and 1990, he served in the US Marine Corps and rose to captain flying amphibious assault helicopters over Lebanon and elsewhere. He's been researching Latin America for literally decades, and he's with us to help unravel what is behind the escalating tensions in the Caribbean. Ambassador John Feeley, hello, and welcome to The Brief.
Thanks, Jim. Real pleasure to be with you.
You know, for the first time in my memory, NPR reported that there were individual members of the U.S. military seeking outside advice, not from the Department of State, the Department of War, or even the U.S. Justice Department about the possibility of their culpability in war crimes. What does that tell us about what's going on between Washington and Venezuela?
What it tells us, Jim, is that we are in, at least for the modern era, literally uncharted waters. The U.S. Navy may have every square millimeter of the Caribbean mapped, and we may be able to pinpoint Nicolas Maduro and his human rights abusing regime with the tip of a Tomahawk missile. But for the young men and women who are working on the front lines of our military, our Navy, our Marine Corps, our Air Force pilots, this administration is putting them into uncharted legal waters. And I think that perhaps the recent resignation of Admiral Alvin Halsey at Southcom, under very quiet and typically and appropriately restrained military sort of non-speak, just saying, I'm going to leave in January, period. That has led to a significant amount of speculation among my colleagues and the Latin American and national security policy crowds as to why does somebody leave right on the precipice of something powerful, the way the president says, if it's not because he doesn't want to be accused of being a war criminal and implementing an illegal order.
Now, the advice that they've been seeking is not only confined to what's happening in the Caribbean with the attacks on the gunboats or the alleged drug boats. It's also spreading out to Gaza. They're worried about that. They're worried about even the deployment of the U.S. military on the streets in the United States as they watch this ping pong back and forth between judges at various levels.
Yeah, just take a look at what's happening in places like Charlotte and things like ICE detentions. We've never seen these before, Jim. You and I spent the early years of our career when we didn't have gray hair in places where people were routinely disappeared, right? That was a term of art that we didn't use in American English. We didn't grow up hearing about people being disappeared like a verb. And yet that is something that we came to know as what authoritarian and dictatorial regimes do with their critics. When they're uncomfortable, they get rid of them. Well, what we're seeing are migrants, mostly brown migrants from the global south, many American citizens being caught up in there because, guess what? We are a diverse, multicultural society. And the people who are doing that detaining, an awful lot of them don't have a clear understanding that A, they're going to be protected in out years by their institution. And then let's think about the military people. I started as a military officer and I spent 7 years in uniform as a Marine Corps officer. And I knew what's called the United States Code of Military Justice. And I knew what was right and I knew what was wrong. And I swore an oath to implement legal orders. And if I had a question about the legality of an order, which frankly I never did during my time in service, I also knew that there would be a transparent process that would validate my questioning of said order. Well, I don't think any of the men and women in uniform today have the guarantee that Pete Hegseth's Department of Defense is going to give them a fair hearing if they question an order. Let's face it, they've already fired all of the inspectors general. They've fired about half of the JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General. Those are the military uniformed lawyers that work in the Pentagon and throughout the Department of Defense. So with all of the legal corps, it's almost like that kind of sad Shakespeare quote from Richard II. The first thing we do is kill all the lawyers. Well, when you look at that play, what you realize is they're about to go in and stage a coup. And the first thing that they've done in the Department of Defense is kill all the major lawyers. They've all been run out. So who's going to protect that 22-year-old seaman second class who's directing the missile onto a boat when the International Criminal Court comes calling in a few years?
You're very familiar with Latin American politics. You've got a long history there, and you've watched events evolve. I'm just wondering, what do you think is the main reason that Donald Trump has promoted this unexpected, really, show of military force, gunboat diplomacy, if you want to call that? Is there one major reason, or are there many?
I think, sadly, it's a confluence of events. I think rarely when you see something like this is there one big meta cause behind it. Look, let's go back to the first administration of Donald Trump, okay? It was very clear that he came in and had a team of national security advisors around him who wanted to push Nicolas Maduro out of office, out of power. And let me be really clear here, Jim. I got no problem with that, okay? Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan regime, Chavismo, they are a human rights abusing criminal mafia that has absolutely created a humanitarian disaster in Venezuela. That's a serious problem. And I don't underestimate the seriousness of that problem. In fact, I dealt with it as a diplomat, as did many of my colleagues. But it's quite another thing to think that you're just going to go in, wave a magic wand, and scare the guy out of office. You know this from all of your Middle East work and your Balkan work. Bad guys don't go easily. Bad guys are bad guys because they hang on and they do terrible things. So we can all sort of, clutch our pearls and think it's terrible. But at the end of the day, before you commit blood and treasure, before you commit the young men and women in the United States military to go and knock off a foreign dictator like we did in Iraq, kind of like what we did in Afghanistan, you damn well better be sure that the stakes are high enough to warrant that kind of expense. I think that this time, Trump 2.0, why they have done this, it's because he has been pushed by a small group of ideological warriors, primarily based out of South Florida and the Cuban-American community. Chief among them is Marco Rubio. I think you could include in there people like Mauricio Claver Caron, who was his special envoy to the region for a while, who was his senior director for national security in the first administration, and who once famously said, "The road to Havana leads through Caracas." So they see this as a continuation of a 60-year failed policy, and that is on Republicans and Democrats. That is our policy towards Cuba. We have sanctioned them, we have isolated them, we have nothing to do with them, we stand off from them, we decry them in diplomatic fora, and what do we have? We have the same thing. We have impoverished Cuban people, and we have absolutely no chance for changing that scenario absent the use of exogenous force. There's no appetite to go and invade Cuba, but the Venezuelans have given us a very thin pretext, and that is drug trafficking. Now, we can dive into it, and we can find out how reed thin that pretext is, but I think that's the main reason why we're seeing this buildup. But I honestly believe that Trump has been played in a sense and has painted himself into a corner. I think if he were left to his own devices, his own instincts would lead him to do what he did at the beginning of his administration 10 months ago, which is to send Rick Grinnell in, his special envoy, and negotiate with a bad guy, because that's what he does. He likes to talk to Putin. He talked to Little Rocket Man. He talks to authoritarians all over the world, and I think it's because he actually feels some kind of simpatico with them in terms of a base understanding of how to divvy up the neighborhood. This part's yours, this part's mine. Xi Jinping, you get Asia. Don't screw with me in the Americas. I think that's how Donald Trump works, but I'm speculating.
Well, so then there are some people who have come here to this looking at what's going on, and they mention that three-letter word, oil. And certainly Venezuela has a lot of it. And there are U.S. companies that, even with sanctions, were enabled to continue working with the Maduro regime.
100% right. I mean, Mike Smith, the CEO of Chevron, those guys have hung in there for as long as I've been dealing with Venezuela. And Venezuela does have the world's largest proven reserves. Now, it has a disastrous oil infrastructure after many, many years of sanctions and its own inattention. I mean, let's make no mistake. I am not a member of the Blame America First crowd. Venezuela is the humanitarian and the economic disaster it is because of Venezuela's own bad management of its country and its economy. But that said, yeah, you're right. The world's largest proven reserves of oil are enticing for certain people. But I have to say, I don't really think that's the major motivator. And again, underscore, I'm speculating here. If I had to say so, I think it's more this notion of spheres of influence, right? We saw it in the January 20th inaugural speech of President Trump. We're going to take back the Panama Canal from the Chinese. Okay, that was a chimera. There's no evidence that the Chinese were running the canal. But that's kind of quieted down now for the good of everybody who's going to buy a widescreen TV on the East Coast this Christmas, because we have the most efficient transit of East Asian manufactured goods coming to the East Coast of the United States, which is the largest market segment in the world. And what we now have, though, is this idea that in the Americas, they've said it out of the Department of Defense, they've said it out of state, this is our backyard. I hate that line, but that's what they say. This is our sphere of influence. So I think that's one thing that Trump instinctively gets as a New Yorker who grew up with the five families of the mafia in New York City. They divvied up the city. And they divvied up the illegal economy. And they knew that war was bad for business. They didn't go all in to the mattresses, as they famously say in The Godfather, because they knew that was bad for business. So I think he probably doesn't want to go to war, but he's got this problem. And it's called Three Crazy Cubans. Those are his words, not mine, about three representatives in the Republican caucus in the House whose votes he needed to get important budget legislation through. He's got a Secretary of State who comes out of that same community, and he has this sense that they've given him that Nicolas Maduro is somehow an existential threat to the United States, or Venezuelans are an existential threat to the United States. And if you remember during the campaign, he trotted out for about 2 weeks, the Venezuelan Tren de Aragua, as he pronounced it, surprisingly rather correctly, are eating dogs and cats in Aurora, Illinois. The police chief was like, sorry, not in my Aurora, Illinois. But this is the kind of performative politics that I think Donald Trump knows he excels in, and that Marco Rubio and a group of kind of almost Ahmed Chalabi, Iraq Redux Cuban Americans have been pushing on him.
Well, all those years ago, and you were in the Trump administration trying to give them some advice, they tried to pursue Maduro through legal means. Remember the graphic that they put up with Maduro at the center, $50,000 reward?
And 50 million. Let's be clear, it's 50 million.
But all of the players were there on one page. and you saw how that government functioned in part off the funding that they were getting from the drug traffickers. Now, as you're saying, that's not the same thing as being the head of a narco cartel for Maduro. He's profiting from it, certainly, but it doesn't mean he's the head of it.
Oh yeah, that's another thin reed that this administration has trotted out. That Nicolas Maduro is the head of. Well, it's interesting because they've now called him the head of two different cartels, which is a pretty neat feat. Not even Pablo Escobar or Chapo Guzman could do that. A couple months ago, they designated the administration designated under IEPA legislation, which is Treasury Department primarily driven legislation. They designated him as the head of the Tren de Aragua. Just for listeners, the Tren de Aragua is a very bad group of individuals. It's a prison gang that was started in a Venezuelan prison in the state of Aragua. They have no known drug trafficking capability via the Caribbean to the United States. They have a very minimal, according to the US FBI, a very minimal presence in the United States. But in other places in Latin America, the Tren de Aragua is a criminal, primarily extortion, robbery, thievery kind of organization. They are not major narcotics traffickers by the DEA's estimation. But they were designated by the United States under this Treasury legislation as a foreign terrorist organization, and they called Nicolas Maduro the head of it. Well, just last week, the State Department designated under its foreign terrorist organization delegated authority, which comes from the Immigration and Nationalization Act, Article 219, a foreign terrorist organization. But here's a really interesting thing about all this, Jim. First of all, you can't really be the head of two cartels, and he's not. As you said, he is the head of I would argue, a criminal syndicate that sits atop a whole bunch of narcotics traffickers and other traffickers, oil traffickers, illegal gold, human traffickers. And if you think back to, for our listeners, think back to the way The Sopranos worked, right? Every week, people collected money, and you had your lieutenants, and they went out, and you passed the envelope up the chain. Well, at the top of that chain sits Nicolas Maduro and a whole bunch of his folks. But he's not there, scheduling when this aircraft departs to take a 500-kilo load of cocaine into the Bahamas. That's left to people well below him, and he doesn't have operational control over them, but he does allow them to operate through a decentralized network of his military generals and admirals and his National Guard leaders in Venezuelan sovereign territory. So no question, again, he's a bad guy. No question, there's a $50 million bounty on his head. I'd love to see Nicolas Maduro in a U.S. court face charges on drug trafficking. But I want to see this all done under the rule of law. And why is that important? Because the rule of law and the law of armed conflict and U.S. adherence to the Geneva Conventions and all these things that the Trump administration currently says, those are niceties, they don't work, we're not going to pay attention to that crap. That's what protects the men and women who wear an American uniform when they go overseas.
And or even carry a U.S. passport.
Or even, there's a very good point, you've seen throughout the Middle East, all of the kidnapping of American citizens just because they're American citizens. So that's why I'm so concerned about this. Not because I want to be soft on Nicolas Maduro, but there's a smart way to do this. If they want to interdict drugs, we know how to do it under the rule of law. If they want to do regime change, which again, I'm not necessarily opposed to, but there's a way to do it. It's called an authorized use of military force. It's something that is voted on by the United States Congress, the Article 1 branch of our Constitution that has the constitutional power to declare a state of war. That's not found in the Article 2 executive branch part of our Constitution. And Donald Trump and his administration, I believe, are abrogating our Constitution in order to do something. We're still not sure what he's going to do. He said on Air Force One.
Yeah, we don't know.
I
We
think
don't
I've
know.
made a call. I don't know what
some
it
people
is.
talk of limited strikes, but one thing we know, I mean, there have been shots fired, yes, but already there is a diplomatic maelstrom that has been swirling around this. Former allies like Colombia now on the outs. Trinidad and Tobago accused of, joining in on the U.S. side. And believe me, the people in that country tell me they are concerned right now about what could happen to them because look, they're 7 miles away from Venezuela. They are a fairly direct target because of their supporting role in this, allowing U.S. warships to dock there in Trinidad and Tobago. So where does that leave? How do you measure the diplomatic fallout here? There's been a lot, economic and diplomatic.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, that's, measuring the diplomatic fallout is totally rearranging the Titanic's deck chairs. The fallout from the last 10 months is that the United States is no longer seen as a reliable international partner in support of a rules-based international order. Full stop. We're just not. And we have to accept that. I mean, this is what we voted for, and this is what we elected, and the president didn't hide it during his 3 campaigns. So it's a tragedy, but I'm not gonna sort of bemoan the fact that the diplomatic fallout is terrible. What I frankly worry about more is the effect this is going to have on, one, our American fighting men and women, two, on the American people and broader electorate. The region, yeah, I care. I do care deeply about Latin America. My whole career was spent there. But frankly, that damage has been done. People I talk to don't believe they're going to be able to trust the United States. And even before, let's be honest, we didn't always live up to our highest ideals of supporting democracy and promoting human rights and equality. But we always had self-correcting mechanisms inside our bureaucracy, whether it was congressional oversight or press. Those guardrails have been effectively stripped away or neutered or debilitated. And so I don't think that, at least for the next couple of years, maybe until midterms, when if potentially one or both houses of Congress are flipped, that there are going to be too many guardrails. The only thing I think that saves us, frankly, in this current conflagration is the White House calculation that another foreign war that could potentially look a lot like Iraq or Afghanistan is not going to be popular in electoral terms with the MAGA base. And I hope that is what keeps the president from making an even more serious mistake than he's already made.
There's been a diplomatic and trade push, competition, if you will, in Latin America now for decades. And we're talking about the Russians who loaned all kinds of money to Venezuela, and they try to get it back in terms of oil and the so-called dark fleet that, really,
they got kind of stiff, though.
Decrepit tankers roaming the world.
With transponders turned off.
China is, and China is trying to make inroads. Even Iran is trying to make inroads. And some of the people I talk to say that this Trump administration is helping them because our argument was always, well, look at their countries and look at the lack of free speech and look at, the way that they go about using force when it's not warranted. Those are the kinds of, and human rights abuses, those are the kinds of things now that we've lost our credibility on those fronts.
100%. Look, nobody should minimize the threat that Russia, Iran, and China, those are your 3 primary actors, represent in the Western Hemisphere. This is something that I watched over my career, my colleagues watched over it, but we also don't do ourselves any service when we engage in kind of games of the boy who cried wolf. I can go back to 2014-15 when then Senator Bob Menendez, currently serving time in a U.S. jail for corruption.
Collecting gold trinkets and putting them in his suit jacket pockets.
But for many years, he was a respected senator, and he was very interested in the Western Hemisphere. He had a very conservative, anti-Havana viewpoint, and he was absolutely convinced that there was a massive proliferation of Iranian intelligence agents. And you can go back and look at the record. The United States government back then, the Obama government, was forced to do an all-agency, all-source review of Iranian activity in the Western Hemisphere. And you know what, Jim? We came up with bupkis, came up with pretty little stuff. There is activity, and we happily have very well-developed intelligence agencies and sources and methods, which we're not going to go into here, but we watch this stuff carefully. But what, again, these sort of ideologues who want to topple these regimes by force or by economic sanctions or whatnot, what they're doing is they're exaggerating the threat to a point where they think this will scare enough Americans into saying, yeah, we got to send in the Marines. I fundamentally don't believe they're succeeding in it, except in their own small caucuses and among their own small constituencies, maybe in Miami-Dade County. I don't think that the Arkansas rice farmer who didn't get his SNAP money this month really gives a good you-know-what about Venezuela or Cuba. But this is what is among the pressures that's bearing down on Donald Trump right now. And because they have so debilitated the federal agencies that are involved, the national security agencies that are involved in the traditional types of pro-con, red cell, blue cell debate, the National Security Council system started in 1947, where you have, a three-tiered assistant secretary, deputy secretary, secretary level deliberative forums who can chew on all this stuff and provide best options to the president. That doesn't exist. They've done away with it. They actually literally took Marco Rubio and put him in dual-hatted as both the NSC and the Secretary of State. So how much deliberation is going on, red cell, blue cell? Who's writing the memcon, the memorandum that says, okay, let's just do a little strategic gaming here. What happens the day after we kill Nicolas Maduro with the Tomahawk strike? That kind of intellectual exercise is not happening right now. And that's a scary thing, because it means that whatever happens is going to be a product of the president's own deliberation inside his head. And as we know, he has a tendency to frequently change his mind, listen to the last voice he heard, and not have a deliberative process that can serve up options for him. And I think right now, Marco Rubio seems to be in ascendancy in being the chief influencer of the president.
Well, we know that the president also is in charge of exaggeration. And now he said 200,000 Americans die of drugs every year. And drugs are a scourge, no doubt about that. But when I look at, the Caribbean Sea, it's not where I really think that the problem is coming from. I know the problem is coming from fentanyl. And that's the drug that, is costing Americans their lives, and opioids for that matter. But, the cocaine, it's a plague, it's a scourge. But it's not the existential threat that the president's talking about. We seem to be in the wrong place, trying to address the wrong problem with maybe even the wrong people. Maybe we should be looking closer to home.
I think you put your finger on it completely. The wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong force. Yes, let me agree wholeheartedly with what you just said, that drugs, illegal drugs, made, manufactured, grown in the Americas is a horrible, horrible scourge in the United States. There's not one of us in the United States who doesn't have within 1 or 2 degrees of separation, meaning a family member, a friend of a family member, somebody who hasn't suffered deeply as a result of drug addiction. We know this. We've tried to deal with this since well before 1973 and the creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency by Richard Nixon. We've had the Nancy Reagan just say no period. We've had periods where administrations have stressed education, prevention, a healthcare approach. We've had other administrations where there has been a little bit more of a law enforcement approach to controlling the importation of illegal narcotics. The fact is, both are necessary, but there are problems that you have to manage. There are problems that don't lend themselves to quick fixes. I think one of the things that authoritarians do around the world with incredible efficiency is they take very complex problems and they offer up very simplistic solutions. I think that's what you see the president doing right here. He's literally said, we've stopped the drugs coming from Venezuela by sea. Well, according to his own DEA, only 8 to 12% of all the cocaine that enters the United States from the Andean region comes through Venezuela. So it was a tiny amount to begin with. As you just said, it's not what's killing Americans. What's killing Americans are the fentanyl overdoses. And there is cocaine that is sprinkled with fentanyl, and all of the narcotics trafficking chain do terrible things. So again, this, when you criticize, and I hope people can appreciate this, when I criticize the Trump administration for what it's doing in the South Caribbean, it's not because I am soft on drugs. It's not because I and my other fellow critics want to go soft on Nicolas Maduro. It's because we're not doing it intelligently. I've said since the beginning of this administration, and when I resigned from it back in 2018, that what characterizes the only real coherence in Trump foreign policy is the consistency of the improvisational amateurism that characterizes it.
Well, I'm going to come full circle here and go back to where we started, really, and that is the U.S. service member, because, you know, I worked with the U.S. military. I've been embedded, whether it was Iraq, Bosnia, Beirut, Lebanon, everywhere. And, you know, I have an experience there, and I have seen the human rights training that officers go through and that they share with our allies. You know, that's an important point. But along comes the new Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and he's saying, no, I want you to be warriors. You forget about human rights. Do you have to be a war criminal to be a warrior?
Absolutely not. But let's not forget, this is the president who pardoned Eddie Gallagher, a convicted war criminal, SEAL from his time in Afghanistan and Iraq, convicted. This president pardoned him. So, yeah, you just put your finger on it. My problem is that I want a warrior class. I'd like to think that as a young man, I was part of that warrior class. I joined the Marine Corps in 1983 and served in uniform as a helicopter pilot, flying off the very ship that's parked down off of the Caribbean right now, the Iwo Jima. It was rededicated. It was a different platform, and they were definitely different aircraft. But I have a visceral understanding of what the men and women who are out there right now, of what they confront, what they face. You know, I just was on a long flight and I rewatched Black Hawk Down. I encourage anybody, any American who's conflicted about whether or not we're doing the right thing right now, to think about those people, those guys, those Rangers, those Task Force 160 guys, Mike Durant, the captured pilot. You know, there are a lot of bad people around the world. There are bad regimes, and there are threats to the United States. And we need a professional warrior class more than ever right now in this very difficult world. But what we don't need are a bunch of renegade war criminals hopped up on monster drink and push-ups like Pete Hegseth has them doing.
We're going to leave it there. Ambassador John Feeley, I want to thank you for joining us for The Brief.
A real pleasure, Jim. Thanks for the time.
And thank you for joining us. Please explore many of our other episodes of The Brief Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Give us a like or subscribe. For a complete listing, you can find more information at thebriefpodcast.org. For now, I'm Jim Clancy, and you've been briefed.